This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and today I'm bringing you a bonus video. We're nearing the end of Crimson Vow Limited Season, with Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Preview Season imminent. So, I thought it would be a good time to take a look back at my Innistrad Crimson Vow set review and talk about the cards that I was significantly wrong about. I of course do these set reviews before actually getting a chance to play with the cards because the goal is to have it ready for everyone by the time of the release on Magic Arena, and it's impossible to get absolutely everything right before actually playing with the set. I do my best, and I think I do a fairly good job, but there's always cards I end up missing the mark on, and that always becomes clear once I actually start playing with the new format. So, in this video, I'll be talking about 14 cards that I was wrong about by more than half a letter grade, and I'll talk about why I was wrong about each of them. Alright, let's get started. So, in white, I think there was only one card I was wrong about. The problem is, that one card I was wrong about was an important one, and that was Traveling Minister, which I was really wrong about. I gave it a D+. For whatever reason in the set review, I really fixated on the fact that you could only activate it as a sorcery, which, yeah, that's a downside, but the ability ended up just being so much better than I anticipated. First of all, it just turns out that giving +1/+0 to a thing every turn enables attacks that you just didn't have before, and that is true even if you don't have training and stuff going on. If you have training, you can make this even more synergistic and sweet, but it just makes creatures into better attackers, and almost every single turn you end up with an attacker that you wouldn't have had otherwise, thanks to the Minister. And it also gains you life, which was important in the black-white deck, and, it just did a ton for only 1 mana. It ended up having a very outsized impact on the game for a 1-mana card, and it really ended up being, I think, white's best common. That means I was really wrong about it, because that means it's like a B-, a card you first pick pretty often. Not pretty often, but you first pick it in some weaker packs. A card you take highly pretty often, and a card that you certainly see as a signal that a color is open if you get it passed to you. Traveling Minister ended up being really, really good. Much, much better than the D+ I gave it. Let's move to blue now. First up, we've got Consuming Tide. So, I don't know why, but every time we see one of these cards, it bounces everything on the board. I really want it to be good, and I overrate it. By this point, I should stop doing that because I don't know how many cards like this we've seen that I've overrated, but this was another one, and I gave it a C+. And it's kind of funny because I don't overrate that many cards in my set reviews. You'll see the vast majority of cards on this list are all cards I underrated, not cards I overrated. But every time I see a mass bounce spell, I just can't help but give it a better grade than it deserves. And I gave this a C+. And I was thinking, yeah, it's symmetrical. Your opponent gets to rebuild the board before you do. But I thought that it would be cheap enough at bouncing all the stuff that, you could play something that was bounced to your hand on the same turn. You could abuse cards that have Enter the Battlefield abilities. I also thought you'd end up drawing a card a decent chunk of the time, and because of that, you end up netting a card in addition to everything else, but all the downsides ended up being too much. You bounce everything, your opponent gets to rebuild before you, the same downsides we see in every single card like this, and it pretty much ended up being unplayable. I think it was an F in the end. Next up, I've got Gutter Skulker. This is actually another card I overrated. I gave it a B, which would mean, it's a high-quality uncommon, a card you first pick really happily. And it wasn't a bad card or anything. It's a 4-mana 3/3 that can't be blocked as long as it's attacking alone. And, that seemed pretty good to me, as did the fact that later in the game, you could disturb it and then stick the aura on a creature to also make that creature have the same ability. In my mind, I was thinking, well, this is 2 must-kill threats, and that's kind of true, but in the end, Gutter Skulker's inefficiency as a 4-mana 3/3 in this format was kind of a liability. This format ended up being fairly fast, and Gutter Skulker was a little slow for the format, and, turning on the evasion from Gutter Skulker wasn't nearly as easy. It didn't come up as much as I would have ever expected. I really thought you'd be attacking with it unblockable a lot, but there were a lot of situations where it just didn't work out that way. Sometimes you had flyers and stuff like that, so it just didn't matter. And Disturb was nice. It gave you value from the graveyard and so forth. And it didn't end up being a bad card or anything like that, but it's a C+ and not a B, which means, you run the first one in basically all your blue decks, but it's not a card you're very excited about. All right, let's move to black now, where the first card I got wrong is Pointed Discussion. So I gave this a C minus. I just saw it as yet another one of these, black divination variants we see where you draw two, lose two for three. And I just thought that wouldn't be anything special, as a C minus would indicate. You'll play it sometimes, but it's nothing great. It doesn't impact the board, and cards like that are often a problem. But in general, blood ended up being better than I expected in this format. It turned out there were a lot of good blood payoffs, and it just turned out that in general, the presence of blood and the fact that you could use it to, filter through your deck a little bit was good, even if you didn't have blood synergy, and it was great if you did have blood synergy. And you pretty much always wanted one of these in every black deck you drafted in the format. Even if you were aggressive, it was a nice way to reload your hand and get another blood that your creatures can use, to get bigger or make something unblockable. So it ended up just being a lot better than I expected, and really pretty much an auto include in every black deck. And I think it was a C plus. You still didn't really want like a bunch of them because it still didn't impact the board, but it just turned out that blood really mattered a lot more than it looked like it would with Pointed Discussion. So the other black card I think I was wrong about was Skulking Killer. I gave this a C. I didn't think it was going to be great. I thought it would be an okay card though, one that made the cut in your deck more often than it didn't. That's what a C really means. But it turns out it was significantly worse than that. It's hard for me to ever see a card like this that can potentially feel like Flame Tongue Kavu, that is, a creature that comes into play and kills a thing, Necrotal, Ravenous Chupacabra, whatever you want to call it. Any of those kinds of cards is just so good and limited because you add to the board and subtract from your opponents. And so I gave this thing the benefit of the doubt, thinking, maybe you'll trigger its ability like a third of the time. And if you're doing that, it seems okay, because that's going to feel really good when you make it happen. But it turns out you basically never trigger it. The combination of the fact that it can only do -2/-2, and the fact that your opponent can only have one creature in play was basically meant that you just wouldn't be able to kill things with it. If they had one creature in play and you could actually use this, turns out they have a 5/5. Things like that would be the big problem. And it just ended up not being very good. It got really close to unplayable. It does have the vampire type, and in a really controlling deck where you can actually make it use its ability like a third of the time, maybe it's playable. I don't quite want to give it an F, but it gets pretty close. I was definitely overrating this card. So let's move to red now. First up, there's Curse of Hospitality. This is actually another card that I overrated, which is unusual. I guess I kind of broke the trend in this set. I overrated more cards than I normally do. Usually there's 2 cards I overrated and 13 that I underrated. And this time around, the ratio isn't quite the same, as this is yet another card I overrated. I gave it a B. I looked at this card and I got excited about the potential for it to let you draw a bunch of cards, and it definitely can do that. It comes down, gives your board trample, and that can often make it so you're going to do combat damage to your opponent, in which case you then get to draw cards from your opponent's library, more or less. And, it does do those things, but there were enough times where you played this and it didn't do anything that it ended up being way worse than a B. A B is a card you first pick all the time. You play in basically every one of your red decks, a card that can take over games in the right situation. And the right situation for this one to take over games, it was usually one where you were already winning anyway, because you've gone wide enough that you're hitting your opponent and drawing cards. Or it makes one of your creatures really big and you can, damage your opponent. But if your creature's trampling over anyway, it means your creature was already the biggest thing around. So it ended up being a win more card when you were ahead and god awful when you were behind or even at parity. And for that reason, I don't think it was anything special. In the end, I think it was a C-, and I might still be overrating it. Next up, we've got Valderran Epicure. So I underrated a white 1-drop. I also underrated a red 1-drop, and that was Valderran Epicure here. I gave this a C. I thought it would be perfectly solid. It comes down early. It has a useful creature type, somewhat useful. Vampire isn't a huge theme in the set, but it's there. And it pings your opponent, and it makes you a blood token. And all of that seemed pretty good, like a lot of little things that give you decent value, and I thought that was enough to make it a solid playable. But as I already noted, I underrated blood significantly, and the fact this makes you a blood token early ended up just being huge. There are creatures you want to play on curve in the black-red deck especially that really like to utilize the blood that you make as soon as possible so that they can get bigger, so that they can transform, so that they can do all kinds of things. And making sure you have blood on turn 1 was a big deal for these black-red decks. In addition to the fact that the Epicure's ping damage really could add up, and it could even attack early, of course, too. Another nice thing about it, too, is like, yeah, I'm talking about the cases where it really helps you take over a game, but there's also situations where you could keep like a one-land hand because you had an Epicure or two, and you could pitch things if you needed to find the land that you need. And similarly, if you're flooding out, you can throw away some land and so forth, as you always can with blood. But because you get this blood so cheaply, it could really help you deal with any problems with your mana in the early game in a way most cards that make blood couldn't. And in the end, this ended up being a really good red common, really a B-, which seems kind of crazy. If you told me this on paper, this card's going to be a B- in this limited format, I would have had a hard time believing it. But having experienced the format and drafted it 40 plus times in the end, I can tell you it is a B-. It really, really sets up a lot of the aggressive decks in the format in a very formidable way, and it was an impressive card overall. Let's move to green now, where first up I've got Dormant Grove, which transforms, of course, into Gnarled Grove Strider. So I like this card in the set review. I gave it a B-, means it's a card you basically always play in your green decks. You can take it pretty highly, even with a first pick and some weaker packs. Just the fact that it could sort of churn out these +1/+1 counters onto your creatures, that kind of effect is always good and limited. It really changes the board state. And the fact that it did it at the beginning of combat meant you got that counter right away, which is a huge deal. The thing about the card that I underrated was how good it would be when it transforms. I thought it would be nice, of course, having a 3/6 with Vigilance that gives your whole board Vigilance is nice, but I didn't really think about just how good it would be. And it ended up being quite good. I mean, you usually, keep it on the +1/+1 counter mode for a while, but then you get to a turn where transforming the Grove Strider into a creature, which, by the way, can attack right away because the Grove has been in play, transforming it allows you to attack with your whole board that's been buffed by this enchantment for several turns, and your whole board has Vigilance. So your opponent's ability to sort of crack back at you is really limited when you give your whole board Vigilance. And this was a card that really could take over games and one of the best, non-rare or mythic green cards in the entire format. I think it was a B+ in the end, a card you would really excitedly take with the first pick, a card that can pull you into its colors even, and that's a big deal. It was a very good card. Next up, I've got Pacsung Pup. I gave this a C+. That means I thought it was going to be a quality card. I liked the idea that it would just get bigger. You could play it on turn 2 after playing a turn 1 werewolf, and it would just grow and get huge. And those are all things I anticipated, but it ended up being far more consistent than I expected. The red-green deck in general was better in this format, significantly better than it was in Midnight Hunt. It was hard not to be influenced somewhat by what we saw in Midnight Hunt because these two sets seem so similar. But there's a lot of significant differences, and this red-green deck is the biggest one probably because I think it ended up being one of the best color pairs in the format after having been one of the worst ones in Midnight Hunt. And Pacsung Pup was a big part of that. It was an excellent wolf payoff that, you could play it on turn 2, and if you did, in your red-green deck especially, if your opponent didn't kill it at some point in the near future, it was going to be a problem for them. And then if they could finally kill it in the later game, you then gained all this life back after all the damage it did to them and all the problems it caused them. So it wasn't even a card where you could sort of get rid of it finally and breathe a sigh of relief because now you could take over the game because you also just let your opponent gain a bunch of life, which makes it a lot harder for you to get back in the game. It was an impressive card overall. It was sort of a build around, but I think there were enough wolves and werewolves just in green that you ended up playing this even in just your green decks. And I think it was a pretty high pick. I think it was a B in the end. Let's move now to multicolored. So I've got the red-green signpost in common here. I gave it a B-, which of course means I thought it was going to be pretty good. But it ended up being even better than that, and that's partly because, again, the red-green deck was better than I expected. The kind of weird thing about this card that I didn't love about it when I was doing the set review was the fact that it doesn't seem that synergistic with a lot of what the red-green deck was doing. It sort of has like a go-wide element to it, but it turns out that it doesn't matter. I mean, and it does have some synergy because it's a werewolf and it can help you add to the board with its activated ability on the front side and then transform all your werewolves by not playing any spells. And, that was a big deal. But the power of this card just in a vacuum was so great that it even though it didn't have incredible synergy necessarily within the red-green color pair, it's not a wolf or werewolf payoff. but it didn't matter because it just did so much. Making the wolf tokens was great. It transforming and buffing your whole board was great. It was just really strong and one of the best signpost uncommons in the set. I think it got upgraded all the way to a B+ from a B-. Next up, we've got Edgar Charmed Groom. I thought this card was going to be really good. I gave it a B+. I thought it was going to, be a huge problem for your opponent. It buffs your whole board, and then it just doesn't stay dead. And all of that ended up being true, but he ended up being a straight up bomb. B+ is, sort of knocking on the door of bomb range, but it's not quite there. And really, I think he ended up being one of the, most impressive bombs in the format. I think he's probably an A+. He just doesn't stay dead. He keeps coming back. The tokens he makes you while he's in his coffin, end up really mattering. This format, like I said already earlier in this video, was fast enough that if he didn't make these little 1/1s while he was waiting in his coffin, you would be in a lot of trouble, and this card would be way, way, way worse. But he does make them, and they can block and keep things going for you while gaining you life. And if your opponent can't pressure you at all, well, he's going to transform, come back, and make them bigger. And so he ended up just being a huge problem. One of the harder cards in the format to beat. Luckily, Bleed Dry was a thing, and it killed and exiled him entirely. But other than that, it was pretty hard to deal with Edgar Charmed Groom, and he was hugely powerful. Next up, it's Growl the Omnivore. So I thought this guy was going to be a bomb. I gave him an A-. And this is another card where I think Midnight Hunt and what Midnight Hunt was affected how I thought about this card. The blue-green self-mill deck was absolutely great in Midnight Hunt. And imagining having this card, just sort of inserting it into that blue-green deck in Midnight Hunt was amazing. Thinking about that, this card would have been a bomb. Just because the fact that he loads up your graveyard while giving you all the permanents in your graveyard to be able to play whenever you want to is amazing. Like, you're just drawing cards every time you mill yourself. That's hugely powerful. The problem was the blue-green deck in this format had a hard time getting off the ground as any sort of synergistic thing, and it wasn't very easy to set up Growl, and you needed to be able to set him up. He's only a 4-mana 3/3. His ability to mill all on his own just isn't enough. And I didn't think it would be when I did the set review. I just thought there would be enough going on in blue-green that you could get him in play, mill yourself, and get tons of value out of it. But it just didn't end up working out that way consistently enough, and he ended up being downgraded for me all the way to a C+. All right, let's move to artifacts now. First up, there's Ceremonial Knife. I gave this a D. Looking at this thing, I understand why I gave it a D. 1 to play and 2 to equip to give +1/+0 to a thing is a horrible boost. But as I've mentioned already, blood was better than I ever expected. This makes blood. It can provide more blood for all your blood synergies. The blood helps you deal with flooding late, etc. So it ended up being better than I expected. I think it was a C- in the end. A card you ended up playing one of, especially like in your black-red decks pretty regularly. And the last card we have to look at is Dollhouse of Horrors. I gave it a B. I thought it would be a little clunky and slow to be a straight-up bomb. Obviously the idea that you would, play this on one turn, make a token, and then keep making tokens, and the tokens you make would gradually get bigger because they're constructs. That whole idea seemed good to me. A B is a good grade. But it turns out Dollhouse of Horrors can pretty much just take over games. The one thing about it was you did sort of need to wait until you could play it and use its ability in the same turn so that you were still adding to your board on a given turn. But once you could do that, it just took over games. Each turn, it would become more and more insurmountable. And it certainly ended up being a bomb. I think it was an A in the end and not just a B. So, those are the cards that I was wrong about in my Crimson Vow set review. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future content, including the upcoming Kamigawa Neon Dynasty set review and a whole lot more, you should subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.